Hello and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm counting down my top 10 films by George Romero, the Zombie King. And because all 6 of his zombie movies are going to be in this list, it's also a way of ranking them as well. Now, every horror fan loves George Romero's zombie movies. They offer a taut, exciting action drama with loads of zombies, a bit of political comment, and also lashings of great ways to kill the undead. They've become the sort of model, the foundation point for the whole zombie genre, really, haven't they? I love George Romero and I've followed his career for years for 2 reasons, really. First of all, there's a wonderful homemade quality about Romero's films, and I mean that in a good way. I'm not in a critical way, I mean in a good way. He was always an independent spirit. He flirted in and out with Hollywood, but he remained an independent spirit all the way through his career. And his films have got an independent feel. His films are not as clean and comfortable as Hollywood films. They're sort of grungy. I remember the first time I saw Martin, his 1970s vampire film, and those shots of Pittsburgh. It seemed like a blasted, lost, post-apocalyptic planet to me. It was an America I'd never seen before in movies, and I really responded to it. And that's the sense I get from Romero's films. They look like they've been made, him and his mates, got 25 grand together, and they've made it in his garden shed and on the streets where he lives. And you see an America that you just don't see in Hollywood films. The second reason why I like Romero is this. It's often said about his zombie movies that they are political allegories, they're political comment. And you can almost see horror fans worldwide, rolling their eyes going, oh, here we go. Mr. Politics again. Yeah, right, they're just zombie movies. Well, let me tell you a personal anecdote. When I was a teenager, right, I noticed that Night of the Living Dead was on one night. It was a Saturday night, about 11 o'clock at night, on Channel 4. And I was a big horror fan. I'd never seen it. I'd read a lot about it. I heard it was one of the classics, so I sat down to watch it. And I got 2 big shocks. The first shock was, I was watching this movie that's supposed classic of cinema, and I thought, it's really grungily shot. It looks crappy. The sound is terrible. The acting is awful. There's no real plot or story or characterization. This is this simple siege of this house with these people I don't really like who are really badly acted. And there's all these zombies going like this. And I thought, really? This is supposed to be one of the best movies ever made? And I stuck with it, right? And then I got the second shock. And that was the ending. So, at the ending, the girl comes back from the dead and viciously stabs her own mother. And then I started to see, right, this is really quite horrible. And for its time, is really subversive. The child killing her parents, the nuclear family being destroyed. And then you get that ending, where the lone survivor, the black man, comes out of, he's survived this night, and he comes out, and the men, all these kind of southern sheriff types, just shoot him down. And even as a sort of 15-year-old, I got it. It really hit me. I knew the imagery, I'd seen that imagery from imagery of the civil rights and Martin Luther King. I knew what he was doing, right? I didn't need anyone to tell me. That's the thing about Romero's films. The politics in the films is very unsubtle. It's very direct. Does that make it bad? No, it makes it more powerful. Let me explain what I mean, right? I did a course once on film writing, film journalism. It was run by Sight and Sound in London, right? And it was very matter of fact. I wanted to write about Kiarostami and Bellatar and Andrei Tarkovsky and all these kind of important art film directors. But the person who ran it, Nick James, who was the editor of Sight and Sound at the time, said, look, you've got to be realistic. If you're going to be a journalist of any kind, you can't just write, 10 pages on Tarkovsky whenever you feel like it. You might have to do what was called a puff piece about Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt, or Jennifer Connelly or something. You might have to do an interview with some actor you're not interested in. You've got to be able to learn to write all kinds of different articles. And one of the things they got us to write was, you might want to be a film critic for a serious film magazine, but you might have to start writing for a tabloid newspaper. So you're going to have to write tabloidese. You're going to have to get your ideas in short, sharp sentences that can be read and understood by anybody, right? It's very, very difficult. You go into it sort of snooty, thinking that, this is writing for dumbasses, right? But you try to write it. You try to write that witty, terse writing in tabloids with puns and jokes. It's very, very hard. There's an art form to it. You know, writing that sort of short, terse, anyone can get it journalism has an art to it just the same as the more complex, more essay-like journalism. Now, in cinema, there are, long-form journalist directors, and there are tabloid directors. Romero is a tabloid director. His politics, his ideas, his themes are sort of boom, 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 just like a tabloid writer in a newspaper like The Sun or the Daily Mirror. In a way, he's the horror equivalent of Sam Fuller. I don't know if you've ever come across this director, Sam Fuller. He was an American director, started making films, I think, very late 40s through into the 50s. He made genre films, just like every other American director. And they're very punchy and in-your-face and unsubtle, right? And some people say, well, that means that Fuller is not a very, complex director. But actually, if you go back and look at Fuller's films, everything that they say has got real, depth to it and truth to it. It's just that he's saying it in a punchy tabloid manner, right? Actually, his films, a lot of what they're saying is quite subtle and quite interesting from a humanist and political point of view, but he's saying it in a sort of tabloid headline way. Romero is doing the same thing. The ending of Night of the Living Dead does have a political resonance, a very powerful and straight-in-your-face one that even a 15-year-old British teenager got in the 80s. And after all, zombies lend themselves to political allegory, because what are zombies? They're an implacable, dehumanised force. You can't argue with them. They just are. They're going to come and kill you, and they come and eat you. And that sense of some overwhelming force that you've got to fight, it reminds me a lot, this is a bit highbrow, but it reminds me of Albert Camus' novel La Peste. And you remember this is set in a North African city, and they get the plague. And it's about how you're going to fight this plague, what you have to do. And each of the characters is distinguished by how they choose to take on the plague. And it's a bit like in Romero, each character is distinguished by their approach to taking on the zombies. It becomes a kind of existential struggle, and that in a sense is a political struggle. Before I get into the top 10 proper, I should say I'm not going to include Monkey Shines, which is definitely one of Romero's best films. But, well, look, it's about this athlete who becomes paralysed, and he's given this little monkey to assist him, and the monkey turns homicidal. I just don't like monkeys. I don't like monkeys or apes. They really unsettle me. They're like sort of hairy humans, and they bother me. Now, I know what you're saying. You're thinking, Mike, that's the whole point of the film. It's a creepy monkey, that's what it's about. Yeah, I know, but I just don't like monkeys, all right? I can stand King Kong. He's kind of like not real, is he? He's like a special effect. King Kong's fine, but sort of, monkeys in movies, I'm not keen, all right? So it's not going to be in the top 10. Now, at number 10 is the last of the zombie series and the least liked film in the group. A lot of horror fans who loved the original trilogy, right, turned their backs on Romero in the 2000s when he did the second trilogy. I'm one of the few people who defend that second trilogy. It's not as good, but it's interesting. And I'm a little bit saddened that people don't like it. The last film, Survival of the Dead, hardly anyone went to see it, let alone liked it. It's ironic, really, because Survival of the Dead, though it's the least interesting of the zombie movies, it's also possibly the best directed. It's the slickest. The action sequence at the dock, the shootout when the zombies going underwater, is brilliantly orchestrated. It's brilliantly, topography and editing is excellent. So it's rather ironic, really, that people gave up on Romero just as he was becoming a good action director in the sort of normal Hollywood sense. The film is also interesting in that it's set on this island where there's these two patriarchs facing off against each other, sort of old cowboy style. And the end image of these two men, undead, still carrying on their feud in the afterlife with this great big moon over them. I don't know, for me, it anticipates Donald Trump somehow. Am I reading too much into it? Maybe, maybe not. In ninth place is one of Romero's non-zombie movies that he made in the early 70s called The Crazies. A pandemic breaks out, which turns people into nutters, and the government has to sort of isolate this village. It's never been one of my favourite movies, The Crazies. It does work. It's interesting. I love the idea of this, that people contract a disease that makes them act purely on impulse. And later on in the early 80s, there was a more restrained, low-key version of this in a film called Impulse, which has vanished from view, but which I first saw when I was a teenager and really made a deep impression on me. I actually prefer that film, I think, to the George Romero version. But The Crazies does have a kind of anarchic, punkish spirit to it, which explodes in really sort of gory action sequences in places. It's worth checking out if you've not seen it. In eighth place, I'm going to pick Diary of the Dead. Now, this was the fifth of the George Romero zombie trilogy, much hated by many horror fans, partly because it was a found footage movie, getting the shaky cams out, seeing it from the character's point of view. And I think it's rather well done, actually. I mean, I think Romero has this idea that he's following this young student film crew making a horror film, and they get caught up in the zombie apocalypse. And then it becomes a disquisition on journalism and filming and the ethics of filmmaking. Perhaps that's why a lot of horror fans didn't really care for it. Interestingly, one of the few people who stood up for the film was the critic Robin Wood. Interesting. I loved it. I'm going to tell you something about Diary of the Dead, and probably once I've said this anecdote, everyone who's ever watched this channel will leave it. But here we go. It's all about what is it that you care for in a movie? What's the experience that you want? I think it was just after I'd seen Diary of the Dead that There Will Be Blood came out, the Paul Thomas Anderson film with Daniel Day-Lewis. And I went to see it because I felt I should. Everyone was saying this is one of the great movies of our time, it's a legendary masterpiece, Daniel Day-Lewis is incredible, you've got to see it. And I spent the entirety of the screening watching it thinking, what the hell am I watching this for? What am I getting out of this? What, some creation myth about linking oil and religion in America? I've seen all this before. I've been there, done it. And I just sat there watching, Daniel Day-Lewis ham it up, which was very entertaining. But the movie I just thought, I don't need this. This is not doing anything for me. Diary of the Dead, a crappy, piss-poorly acted film with bad exposition, I think gave me so much more truth about what was going on in America at the time. Paul Thomas Anderson's film is a capital A piece of art. Look at me, look at the grandstanding, look at this score we've built up. Look at the way we've orchestrated each scene. Look at the way we're examining these grand themes. And I just felt, yeah, I've been there, done it. You're not giving me anything extra. Diary of the Dead, a cheap jack, scummy little horror picture, said everything it needed to, and it gave me loads of zombies being killed in very exciting ways. And I've got that movie right there on DVD, and I don't have There Will Be Blood, and I have no interest in getting There Will Be Blood. What I'm interested in a movie is not whether it's well made. Does it have brilliant cinematography? Does it have a brilliant score? Does it have great acting? I don't care about that. What I care about is the whole, and the sensibility of the whole. And Romero's sensibility, this kind of puckish tabloid writer who wants to punch you in the face, is a sensibility that I respect and like more than Paul Thomas Anderson's grandstanding, I'm an artist, respect me. But actually when you look, behind all the grandstanding elements, there's not actually that much philosophy or interest. So there you go. Seventh place. Now, in seventh place, I'm going to put Day of the Dead. This was the last of the original trilogy. I have such mixed feelings about this film. On the one hand, you could argue that it's the best made, fullest exploration of the zombie apocalypse in the original trilogy. It's well written, it's very powerful, very horrible, and, very tense. You're trapped in this nuclear bunker with a group of people who are all really unlikable. There's no one sympathetic in the entire movie. The whole movie's in this grey cell underground with people shouting at each other. It's the most overtly political of the 6 zombie movies, which is probably why I don't like it so much. It's a hard going, it's very good. And I respect Romero for doing it. And the way he develops the zombie ethos so that the zombies start to gain some kind of sentience, some kind of society which has been built on in all sorts of things since, like The Walking Dead. It's very clever. And, in that sense, it's a very good film. I just don't think it's very likeable. Watching it is, you sort of have to wince and get through it. And at the end of it, you think, wow, that's a really impressive movie, but I might not want to watch it again, thanks very much. It's pretty brutal. Now, in sixth place, I've put one of Romero's lesser-known films. And that film is Season of the Witch. I think it was the third film he ever made. And it just vanished without trace. No one cared about it. The reason is that though on the surface it's a horror film, it's not really a horror film at all. It's kind of like The Stepford Wives a bit. It's an examination of suburban life. This woman married to this guy, this businessman out in the suburbs. And, her life is not going so well. And there's tensions, and is her husband having an affair and all the rest of it. And she turns to witchcraft. And in witchcraft, she finds herself. Now, long-term viewers of this channel will know that I'm fascinated by witchcraft. And I think that Romero explores the subject really well. He's using it as a metaphor to look at modern-day American relationships and the marriage from a feminist perspective. That's obviously what the movie is about. But what is a surprise is how intelligently the movie explores that. And the mood of the film, I really love the mood of the film. It captures that wonderful moment in American, late 60s, early 70s, which I love. But it's also genuinely disturbing in a light but increasing way. And there's no other movie that's quite so subtle, I think, in Romero's filmography, and that's why I kind of value it. It's been released on the UK on a very good Blu-ray. Track it down. It's not very well known, it's not very well liked. Horror fans tend to ignore it because it's not horror-y enough. But it's well worth your time. It's a very, very good movie. In fifth place, Land of the Dead. Now, this was Romero's return. After almost 20 years not making a zombie movie, this was the first of his second trilogy. I love this movie. At the time, this movie's lost some of its resonance in the years since, but when it came out just after the New Orleans floods that Spike Lee looked at in his documentary. I don't know if you remember this. And of course, there's that fantastic scene where the dead go under the river and then rise out of the river to take, revenge on the people in the city. And that had such resonance at the time because there was this feeling that the people of New Orleans had not been treated properly and had been abandoned in these floods. And then you get that fantastic scene at the end with Dennis Hopper. He's in the car and the lead zombie comes up and shoves a petrol pump through the windscreen and sort of drowns him in petrol. I thought those scenes were fantastic. That's what I mean about this kind of in-your-face punchiness, tabloid ease of Romero's filmmaking. He just gets to the point. Land of the Dead at first was a bit discombobulating because it's made like a sort of modern Hollywood action movie. And it's even got this kind of battle truck that the heroes are in. And at first I didn't really like that. But I've come to really love this movie. I've come to really value it. I think it's as brilliant a response to the times as the first three films were to the 60s, 70s and 80s respectively. And I go back and watch it with great enthusiasm now. I think so many of the zombie movies and zombie series on television and film have cribbed from it, really. And it's got some great, great moments. The zombies looking up at the July the 4th fireworks and all that sort of stuff. I love it. I think it's great. Now, for my fourth and third placings, I'm going to move away from the zombie movies to look at two really intriguing movies that Romero made in the middle of his career. The first is Martin. This was made in the late 70s, and it's an attempt to make a modern vampire story. And I actually think it's one of the best vampire movies ever made. It's about a young guy, sort of late teenage sort of years, and he's developed a taste for blood. He thinks he's a vampire. And he starts attacking people quite brutally in the very first sequence of the film. He's taken in by his elder cousin in Pittsburgh, and his elder cousin is a bit of a religious zealot. And part of the film is attacking religious zealots, and dogma. But it doesn't work, and eventually Martin just feels completely alienated. It's a film that's sort of examining alienated youth, the idea of being different and feeling different from the norm, and how the issue, religion and society doesn't really seem to cope with that and doesn't really seem to help. And eventually Martin is killed, and it's a wasted life, a wasted potential. Was he mentally ill? Could he have been helped by psychiatry? Could he have been helped by the authorities? We'll never really know. So it's a very sad film. Part of what I like about it is its plastic feel, the shots of Pittsburgh, the run-downness of the whole area. It's a very melancholy film, shot in melancholy tones, and I quite like that about it. But also, I like the fact that it has this sympathy for this potentially horrible person, with a sort of anger at the world around him, refusing to understand or even recognise what's going on with him. It's a really interesting film. If you've never seen it, please try it. An even more interesting film came later on in the early 80s, Night Riders. Have you ever seen this movie? It's a fascinating updating of the King Arthur legend. And it's set amongst this travelling troupe of entertainers on the road in America. And what they do is, they do sort of medieval jousts with banquets on motorbikes. So it's like Easy Rider meets King Arthur, right? And they're all led by a very young Ed Harris. And he plays the kind of King Arthur part. And he finds that this promoter has come along and wants to he wants them to go away from being independent, like George Romero, into big business, like Hollywood. And it starts to split the troupe apart. And that's the story of the film. And it's about Ed Harris trying to keep his kingdom together. I love this film. I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the great lost American classics. It's about all that stuff that American cinema was about in the 80s. It's about the loss of innocence and the growth of the corruption of capitalism and business. It's about trying to, stay true to your ideals and your youth. It's about Easy Rider sort of bumping into the new 80s world of Ronald Reagan. I think it's a beautiful film. I think it's very moving. It's got a wonderful innocence, a wonderful sense of fun about it. It tells the Arthurian tale in a completely different way, but it also shows American society and its dream in a completely different way. Do check it out. So we come to the top two, and you knew what they were going to be all along, didn't you, really? I found it quite hard to choose between these two films. If I'd gone with my heart, I'd have put Dawn of the Dead top. As it is, I've put it second for reasons that I'll explain. Dawn of the Dead, for me, is the best of Romero's films as a movie. It comes up with this ingenious sort of metaphor where the dead go back to the place that they knew when they were alive, which is, of course, a shopping mall. And our heroes are holed up in this shopping mall fighting off the zombies. I think that's just absolutely brilliant. It's a brilliant siege environment for the story, and it's a brilliant idea. And this movie's got everything. It's got great zombie deaths, great action sequences, and it's got music by Goblin. I mean, come on. It's one of the great horror movies of the 70s. You cannot resist it if you're a horror movie fan. But I put Night of the Living Dead top, not because it's a better movie, because it isn't. Nowhere near. I put Night of the Living Dead top because I think it is one of the most iconic horror films ever made, and it changed the genre. Going back to that teenage self, right? There I was at home, thinking this movie's really grungy. But what I didn't quite get was that grunginess, that sort of lo-fi crappiness of Night of the Living Dead, is part of its brilliance. I thought it was just bad filmmaking. But what I didn't see was that when I got to know about the history of horror films and filmmaking, that sort of, subversive, independent feel of the film is part of what makes it so frightening, right? Before, the horror film is a well-made film, like a Western or a musical or everything, right? It has supernatural overtones. But with Night of the Living Dead, anything could happen, because the movie is kind of crappy. It's not a respectable piece made for a wide audience. It's a kind of grungy thing that you find at the bottom of a video bin for $4 in some kind of crappy store. And that's the huge step that it takes, strangely. You could argue that the first film to really give that feel was Herc Harvey's Carnival of Souls back in the early 60s. But that movie is much more of a supernatural, sort of weird story piece. Whereas Romero's film, it pushes horror forward into a world of genuine horror, of zombies that come out of the earth, that eat you, that are going to gnaw your limbs. There's no respectability here. There's none of that idea where, we shouldn't see the horror because that detracts from it. No, Romero says, I want to see it. I want to see zombies getting killed and shot. I want to see people being eaten. And the grunginess of it adds to the impact. There's no safe zone here. When you're watching a Hammer horror film or a Universal film, you're safe in the respectability of the storytelling and the character building. You know when there's a set-piece horror moment coming up. In Romero zombie movies, you're on your own. Anything could happen. There's a kind of anarchy here. And it's the anarchic style of the filmmaking that adds to that sense. I think when Romero gets to Dawn of the Dead, he's actually become a more assured filmmaker. And the action sequences and the build-up and the tension of the siege is more brilliantly managed. And I think that's his best film. But Night of the Living Dead did so much for the horror genre. It took us, arguably for the first time, out of the supernatural and terror into genuine horror. It was a real step forward for the entire genre, and that's why I'm putting it at number 1. So before I leave you, this is my ranking of the 6 zombie movies, for those zombie fans out there who want to know. But please let me know your thoughts on George Romero and all of his movies. I'd love to hear from you below. Thanks very much.